So welcome to the next lesson on the Sunningdale Agreement and the Power Sharing Executive, and you find us on page 459 of your textbook. And now we're going to look at the reactions to the agreement. So once the agreement is made and it becomes, law, for want of a better phrase, and before the elections really start to kick in, we're going to look at the attitudes of the different people in Northern Ireland about this agreement. Especially when you look at the question, like for the 2020 question, what was the Sunningdale Agreement and why did the executive collapse? These are some of the reasons as to why it would collapse. It's also some of the reasons as to why it actually got going in the first place and didn't just die on arrival. It actually did get going but would eventually collapse. Let's have a look. So paramilitaries. Now, paramilitaries are the people with guns. It's like the Provisional IRA, it's the UDA, it's the UVF, groups like that. They immediately refused to cooperate with the agreement for obvious reasons. For the likes of the UVF and the UDA is that they don't want to share power with Catholics, they see, and they don't want any sort of cross-border activities. But what about the IRA? The IRA is the Irish Republican Army, and it's the provisional IRA. There's lots of different kinds of IRA, but this is the provisional one. And their point is that it's just another way of being ruled by Protestants. It's not a republic, it's not the end of Northern Ireland, it's not unification between North and South, and it's not the end of partition. So why would we get involved with it when what we're fighting for is a united Ireland? So that's their approach to it. You have the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, and when we look at some of the words, and Ian Paisley's going to mention now in a second, we'll see how democratic they actually are. And the Democratic Unionist Party is led by a religious leader called Ian Paisley. Now, Ian Paisley is a massive figure when it comes to Northern Irish politics from the 1960s right the way up until the 2000s, because in the 1960s the Ian Paisley that we see here is vehemently anti-Catholic, to such an extent that he is aggressive towards Catholics, that he is rude and disrespectful beyond belief towards Catholics, and he is vehemently opposed to the agreement. And if you go on to the next page, on page 460, you'll see a quote from him about the agreement. And he says, "I say to the Dublin government," in other words, down in the Dáil, Mr. Faulkner, which is the leader of the Ulster Unionist Party, who we're going to talk about him now in a second, who was really pushing this agreement, says that it's hands across the border. That's a quote. In other words, it is an opportunity for us to work together, North and South. I say that if they don't behave themselves in the South, I like that phrase, if they don't behave themselves and do what they're told, in other words, try to muscle in on Northern Ireland, it will be shots across the border. Is he talking metaphorically? Is he talking literally? Does he literally mean that there will be a civil war in Ireland because of this Sunningdale Agreement? This is the Ian Paisley that most people would have been used to right the way up until the 2000s. And what happens in the 2000s is really interesting when it comes to Ian Paisley, because he's still leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, but at this, like in the 1960s, they were a kind of minority group, and whereas the UUP would have been the more kind of popularised group. In the 2000s it switches and the DUP becomes the primary Unionist Party in Northern Ireland. And what happens is really strange, because he becomes far more moderate as he gets older and far more conciliatory towards Catholics and nationalists in the North. And when he becomes First Minister in the 2000s, the person who he has to work closest with is Martin McGuinness, who is a former Provisional IRA member, who was the leader of Sinn Féin. And the two of them became really strong friends. And it was an example to people around the world about how you could have two completely opposing sides who are at each other's throats, literally as well as metaphorically, for decades, who can come together for peace. And it was used as an example for people all around the world that, yes, you can, even though you have strife now, you can work towards that. But it's just interesting to see how kind of things can change over time. So if we go back up, we'll see the next part. What about the Ulster Unionists? Well, there's a guy called Craig, that's a second name, and what happens is he leads the anti-agreement stance. So Craig is on the anti-agreement side. Now think back to the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921. You had the pro-treaty and the anti-treaty side. He's the anti-agreement side, and what he's going to do is he's going to end up splitting the Unionists. He's going to split that Unionist vote between, are you going to vote for a pro-Unionist side, or a pro-agreement Unionist, or an anti-agreement Unionist? And we have also the Orange Order. Now, the Orange Order is this group that celebrates William of Orange beating King James in the Battle of the Boyne. They're called the Orange Order because of him. And they are in opposition to the agreement as well. Now, why are all of these not just extremist Protestants, but moderate Protestant and Unionists? Why are they against it as well? Well, all Protestant dissent is simply because they don't want to give up power to Catholics. And this agreement gives Catholics far more of a say in Northern Ireland. And this could be Catholics in the kind of nationalist side of Northern Ireland, as well as Catholics in the south. And they don't want any sort of connection between the north and the south in Ireland. They want to keep their connection in terms of the union between Northern Ireland and Britain. That's what they want. And we need to look at the interesting parts about this, because some Unionists are willing to work with nationalists. But then we look at the nationalist side, some nationalists are willing to work with Unionists, and then the extremist nationalists won't. So the extremes on both sides are against the agreement, and the moderates on both sides are for the agreement. So let's see who's able to, win when it comes to the argument about it. And so the moderates in the middle, they're in agreement with the Sunningdale agreement. Sunningdale is just the name of the place that the agreement was made and signed. So the UUP is under a guy called Faulkner. He's pro-agreement, okay? And then the SDLP, Social Democratic and Labour Party, that's led by a guy called Jerry Fitt. They're the nationalists who have the most amount of power. Now, similar enough to how the DUP takes over from the UUP in the kind of 2000s, the same happens on the nationalist side, where Sinn Féin takes over from the SDLP. But the SDLP would be the kind of the moderate nationalists, where Sinn Féin are on the edge, associated with the IRA and the paramilitary, kind of a more militant aspect. So the UUP support the agreement, but only by a narrow margin. So we would take the entirety of the UUP. The majority do support it, but they are split pretty much 60-40, so they have a sizable minority. So the UUP and the SDLP both saw this as an opportunity to achieve independence for Northern Ireland. We're talking about Northern Ireland, who's been directly ruled by Britain for 2 years. Now is an opportunity to rule Northern Ireland again, have it been run by Northern Irish people instead of a politician over in Westminster. But both of them have ulterior motives to this. Jerry Fitt sees it as a stepping stone towards this united Ireland. That's how he sees this, because it's, well, we have Catholics in power now, and in 10-20 years Catholics will have even more power. Maybe we'll be in the majority by then, and then in maybe 10 or 20 years after that we can unify Ireland, which is pretty much where we be today. Whereas on the other side, Faulkner sees it as, well, this shows that Northern Ireland is a separate country as part of the United Kingdom, and it shows how we can rule ourselves in relation to the United Kingdom. So both of them are looking at the same thing but spinning it in a different direction. We always talk about this idea of spin, how you take a particular fact or a particular argument and make it make sense for you. And that's how each side is looking at it. So extremists saw the agreement as giving the Republic too much of a say because of this idea of the Council of Ireland. And that's why they would stay on basically on the extremes of this argument, and they would say no. And this is the extremist kind of Protestants. Whereas the extremist Catholics and the extremist nationalists, in other words the Republicans, they say this agreement doesn't bring a republic to Northern Ireland. There's a lot of information that I just gave you there. And I've talked about a whole disparate sort of people throughout this entire thing, and it can get confusing. And that's kind of the point. If you want people to back an agreement, you're going to have the majority of the people basically at least tolerant of it. And that's not what's happening here. You have people accepting this agreement for different reasons, people rejecting this agreement for different reasons, and splitting Northern Ireland nearly 50-50 over this. But we need to look at how the protests actually go once the agreement gets going. Because when the agreement gets going, it can either be a success and the protests get drowned out, or the opposite. The protests overwhelm the agreement and bring it down. So let's have a look at what actually happens in the next couple of lessons. I'll see you then.